Well, good morning. We get closer and closer, don't we, to this fateful holiday season that brings us into the stores and gets us to part with our money and does everything except remember that this is celebrated because of the birth of Christ. Christianity, I suppose, is under attack in ways that probably it hasn't been for quite a long time. However, it'll be interesting to see how religion takes place, a part in the future of our race and of our nation, of the world. As I say to a lot of the people that I train in London, nothing changes. Of course it does. Change happens all the time, almost on an hour-to-hour basis, second-to-second basis. Who can predict what we're going to see in the future? Because we live in very unsettled times. Now, first of all, one of the things that is an absolute beauty about being able to do these sort of broadcasts is technology. The fact is, this camera is embedded in an iPhone. You had a camera for years in iPhones, but you couldn't really broadcast with it until Facebook came along and said, okay, let's do it live. YouTube had a live system, but not quite as accessible as this one. So the technology was there to do it, but the means to do it really weren't. And what I'm really leading up to is the fact that all this is self-op. So mistakes are always being made. We're always doing something wrong. But a friend of mine said, Keith, I watched with some interest, you idiot, in what you're doing. And he said, the one thing is, I couldn't see your eyes. And is it because of your hat? Well, I don't think so, John. I suspect it may well be my spectacles. The trouble is, when I take my spectacles off, I can't see anything, which is a bit of a disaster, because if anything pops up onto the screen, which is to alert me that things are going wrong, I wouldn't be able to see, and I would just burble on, which I quite often do anyway. So you'll have to forgive me if I have my spectacles on. Wearing spectacles is a strange thing, because I didn't have to wear them until I was, I think over 40. My late wife, on the other hand, wore them from childhood. She knew how to handle them. I still don't. I don't know how to keep them clean. I don't know how to wear them properly. I never know when to take them off and when to put them on. But the fact of the matter is, of course, is that at one time people didn't like to admit that they wore spectacles. And then the Americans came up with this wonderful phrase, face furniture, and it all changed. Everybody wanted to wear spectacles. But anyway, there is the spectacles covering my eyes, and just in case, even though I can't see, you see, they are blue eyes. Oh, right. I used to have blonde hair, but those days are gone, I'm afraid. But anyway, chaps, we often talk about politics, so the eyes have it. If we're going to be that corny all morning. God bless us. There we are. The hat's back on, and anyway, I hope that it doesn't obscure my face. Some people would say, oh yes, please, let it obscure your face. But there we go. Now, let's talk about a couple of things, because one of the one of the things that I see that in all the hoo-ha that's going on in Parliament, that there is legislation to protect small businesses from late payment, and that it will be against the law to take more than 30 days to pay a small business. And that will save a lot of firms from disaster. Believe me, I've experienced this sort of thing, and I know I've hit disaster because of that sort of thing. And it's not that in my case, the people that I dealt with weren't particularly bad people. It's just that when they have problems, they go ping, ping, ping down the line, and they hit the little guy in the pocket. And he then has to hit all sorts of other people, normally little guys that he's dealing with, in the pocket, and so he goes on. But it all starts with some big organisation, and apparently the recent scandal over Carillon is that they had a deliberate policy that small businesses would not be paid for 60 days, no matter what any agreement said. And if you worked, or you a subcontractor, or you had any sort of self-employed work with Carillon, you were in trouble, because they would say one thing and do another, and it's obviously widespread. So the government is introducing legislation now. Whether in fact that will ever get passed, who knows? Because nowadays, with lobbying and so on, if somebody's going to scream that that'll affect our cash flow, well, the big boys don't care whether it affects the little guys and who that affects in turn. So perhaps it's time for the government to put its foot down with a heavy hand, as it were, and do something about it, because it's a killer. And it's not just that it affects people individually. It also affects the economy, because the more small businesses that go out of business, small businesses that go out of business, yes, I suppose that's the phrase, the more the economy begins to creak, because small businesses, believe it or not, what's known as a small to medium-sized enterprise, account for 80% of the businesses in operation across the European Union. Now that's a lot. So if they start to suffer and they start to go bust, perhaps you can see what's going to happen to the economy. It's all very well to talk about the guy who hires and employs 5,000, 10,000 people. Of course he's important. But the little guy is as well, because he jointly is employing far more across the European Union than any of these big boys. So just think of that when this sort of legislation comes through, and say to your MP, yeah, come on, get behind this. Because quite often this sort of stuff comes before the House of Commons and it gets dumped or it gets pushed aside, and we hear about it 5 years later. And talking about hearing things later, I haven't for a while said bring Anna back. Anna Campbell still hasn't been returned from the front in Syria. And those people who don't know what we're talking about, Anna Campbell was a 26-year-old girl who, through conviction, went to fight with the Kurds in the Middle East, North Africa, and she was killed. And her parents, who live in Lewis, very decent people they are too, Dirk Campbell, a well-known local piper, and they've been trying it happened in May, as I recall. So they've been more than 6 months trying to get the Foreign Office to act, and for that matter the Turkish government, who have some responsibility to bring her body back so that she becomes a proper funeral and a proper burial, and they can have closure. Well, nothing's happened. And when you see all the scurrying to and fro about what I would consider to be peripheral things, there is no reason why our government can't do something to help this family. And it's the individual that we've got to worry about in our community now. Because, believe me, if we're going to follow what's going on in the House of Commons, whoa, and the House of Lords is even worse, whoa. And I don't suppose really, with the best will in the world, that while we revere to some extent the royal family, we don't want to see a return of a monarch in supreme power. Oliver Cromwell lopped somebody's head off to get rid of that. So we are in a bit of a pickle. And this is, once again, it's like small business. It always trickles down to the individual. So that because of the problems at the top, there are small things which would mean so much to a community and to the citizens. And after all, what makes up a state, only its citizens, is not being followed. Nothing's been done about it. And it's time that we started to look at our whole structure. Lewis District Council, you're included in this, by the way. I'm just looking up to see what the time is. Oh, I've still got 5 minutes left. Well, I haven't really. I'm trying to cut down on these things. One of the things, going back to small businesses, is that the big banks, they say, in fact, I've said it's fake advertising. We are the bank for small business, and come to us and help small businessmen. They don't. They haven't a clue. The people who work in the bank, it doesn't matter what level, they get a check and away they go at the end of the month. And they probably get bonuses and they got bits and pieces and so on. And the higher you go, the bigger the bonus. Now, I have to say that individually, on the shop floor, I've been treated quite well by the banks. But their systems are awful. They don't take any account of small businessmen at all. Not at all. And that's got to be rethought as well. There's no sense in attacking big business if you're not actually going to include the banks in there so that they restructure a little to understand the ups and downs of somebody who is in private enterprise, whether that be a freelancer or whether it be a small business or whatever. They just do not understand cash flow. Oh, they'll talk to you about it. They'll send out forms and they'll give you advisories and so on. This is how you handle your funds. Yes, as far as the bank is concerned, it is. All they want is to make sure it comes into their coffers. So they've got it there and they've got interest against it. So the whole sector needs looking at. And hopefully, whoever is in charge of small business, and I've forgotten, isn't like Chris Grayling, who came under fire about the trains yesterday, or it came under fire just a few days ago, but yesterday it was highlighted in most of the papers that the Standing Committee on Transport in the House of Commons had condemned what was happening with the big rail operators and condemned the Department of Transport for its hands-off approach and the fact that we're all going to pay another 3% on our tickets come January. And there's a rebellion brewing. People are saying they're not going to pay it. And as I posed this question to another elderly friend of mine, well, what are they going to do? He said, well, they jump over the barriers. And we looked at each other, knowing that's not a solution for us. If we're not going to pay, we're going to have to find another way of doing it. It's buy a platform ticket and then argue with the conductor on the train. Not a conductor anymore, onboard supervisor. I've forgotten what we call the driver. You get carried away, don't we, with language. It's so silly because actually most of the world that speak English understand the principle, keep it simple. People who invented English, us, we don't. We complicate it all the time. We're almost afraid to speak in case we say the wrong thing. It's bloody stupid. But then again, you see, I grew up in an era where we didn't get too excited about such things. Language was very plain and blunt, and the further north you went, the blunter it got, and you understood what somebody was saying to you. Nowadays, not only is it difficult to know what's being said, particularly in the written word, but also what does it mean? Oh dear, don't offend this and don't offend that. I'm old. I've been offended around the world. Why do I care? What I want to know is, what is it that you're saying? And governments and organisations and institutions, they don't tell you anymore because they're so wrapped up in this double speak. It's crazy. Is it the Society for Plain English? We better get cracking. Boot a few of these people in the ass. Is that plain enough? No, because I just used a North American term, ass. Why do I boot it in the ass? Well, it's the arse in this country. The arse. Oh boy, I'm having fun this morning. Lewis District Council, the more I read about this 20-year plan, the more alarmed I am that LDC, like the people in Westminster, are out of control totally. They only think in their own terms. And there is really politicians now and the executive And there is some suggestion from some quarters that the executive, in this case, pulled the wool over Lewis District Council's eyes. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it's worth taking a look at, I think, by somebody, perhaps some external investigator, because unfortunately, investigative journalism is so costly nowadays, there's very little of it. And yet it uncovered some dreadful things in our society in the past. But a good investigative journalist should have a little go at this. And I know one or two of the remaining investigative journalists in London. I have been sort of saying all is not well in the state of Denmark, or at least in the state of Lewis. And perhaps it's worth a really deep look, an investigative journalist look. Let's see what transpires on that. Wish I could do it. Wish we could do it. It's an expensive process, and it sometimes doesn't bring any results at all. A small business, nobody pays even within 60 days when you're on an investigative journalism trail. You just have to bear the cost and grin and get on with it. Well, that's not always possible, and people take advantage. It's going to get very cold, very cold. Not this week, but next week. The temperatures are going to hover between 3 and or 2. 2 is a low, and the very most is a high 7 degrees. So wrap up warm and be prepared for it, because when it hits, it was chilly enough at the beginning of this week, but when it hits, it can be devastating, particularly to some people my age. I say some people my age. I think I've been frozen in the past and nothing seems to get at me except my Parkinson's, and that is slowing me down a wee bit. I did hobble the streets of London yesterday, and thank God for my walking stick. Anyway, I rambled on enough. There are so many things. But just one thing, because I've deliberately stayed away from Brexit and what's happening. It doesn't matter whether I support Brexit or I don't support Brexit or whatever. The point is there are 2 or 3 principles at stake here, and that is the freedom of a community, a freedom of a people. And the Archbishop of York, Santanu, forgive me if I'm rushing and I mispronounce that, but Santanu, he actually has said, even though he was a Remainer, that he is worried that if there is a second vote that we've undermined democracy and democracy will start to fail and we may even see violence in the streets. Now, is that crying wolf? I don't know. But the other thing is that Mikhail Gorbachev, and people say, oh, well, he's a Russian, wasn't he? Yeah, but he was one of the more astute and brave members of the political class of this last century. He led Russia to glasnost at his own personal cost, and he says he doesn't understand why Western politicians are rushing as fast as they are towards setting up the old Soviet Union. I think there are a few things to worry about here, and remember, you're not talking to somebody in me who doesn't know something about the EU. I've worked there in the EU, and I've worked for the EU, and I know some of the abuses. So every time you say, I may not be able to work there, think a bit deeper. I'm not saying one way or another what we should do. I'm just raising the question that some of these issues should enter the debate. Dare I go outside? Never such a divisive issue in all the history of the United Kingdom as Brexit. But there we are. We can't ignore it. It's there, and we have to live with it. Ta-ra.